Disinflation, definitionally, but maybe even deflation is the opposite, at least for the time being. Inflation is the end game. It has to be, because there's no way out from under the debt. But right now, and people are still worried about inflation. Prices are still going up. I put gas in my car just like everyone else, so I'm well aware of it, eggs, bacon, et cetera. But inflation has been coming down steadily since June of 2022. So about 7 months in a row, 8 months in a row. It peaked then. We all know what gas prices were doing and so forth. But the reason is kind of interesting. And inflation, nominally, prices are going up. Okay, so that's inflation. But it can come from two sources that are opposite. One is from supply-side shocks, supply chain disruption. We saw that in 1973 with the Arab oil embargo over the Arab-Israeli war at the time. The price of oil quadrupled, et cetera. That was a supply shock. The thing about supply-side inflation is it's self-negating. It burns itself out. So, the old saying, and it's true, the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices. In other words, when things get too expensive because of supply disruption, people can't afford them, businesses close, you get layoffs, you go into recession, and prices come down pretty quickly after that. The other source of inflation is from the demand side, and this is a completely different dynamic. We saw this in the late 70s, where prices are going up, but people have some bargaining power, so unions are on strike, they're getting higher wages. I worked at Citibank in the late 70s, early 80s. They used to give us raises without asking. They just say, here's another $20,000, because they knew that the cost of living was going up, and we would all change jobs if they didn't pay us more. So, but that feeds on itself. So the supply side disruption tends to snuff itself out. The demand side inflation tends to feed on itself. It gets out of control. And then we saw what Paul Volcker did with interest rates in 1981, where he took them to 20%. He caused a recession in terms of tight monetary policy to snuff out the inflation. But otherwise, if you don't do that, that just runs away. Now, the inflation we saw in 2022, late 2021, 2022, it was real. It wasn't transitory the way Jay Powell said. And, the price of gasoline doubled, more than doubled, and all the other complaints you hear, the filling up your Ford F-150 pickup truck went from $70 to $140, which for a lot of people that meant they couldn't eat or couldn't, go out. It was killing demand in, entertainment, shopping, retail, a lot of other things, which again tends to snuff it out. So that has happened to a great extent. Starting in June 2022, that was the peak, and this inflation is coming down. Now, it's still too high. The Fed's not done. We're going to see at least one more interest rate hike, maybe, but they're going to leave one more on the table. We'll see what happens in June. I'm not forecasting June, but I would not rule out another interest rate hike in June after the May hike. So, because Jay Powell's thinking, how many times do I have to say this? He's given 9 speeches since August 2022, August 26th at the Jackson Hole, then September FOMC meeting, November FOMC meeting, end of November, a speech at the Brookings Institution, December FOMC, congressional testimony, et cetera. And every time he said the same thing. Inflation is job one. We've got to get unemployment up. Believe it or not, we're going to have a recession and unemployment's going to go up. Sorry about that, but we've got to get inflation under control. And until we do, what's under control mean? Well, it's 2%. That's their goal. Well, it's come down from 9 to 5. Nice job, but 5's still a far cry from 2, and it gets harder as you go along. And they're searching for what they call the terminal rate. So the terminal rate, no one knows what the number is. I don't know because Jay Powell doesn't know, but the terminal rate by definition it's a rate that's high enough that it brings inflation down on its own without further rate hikes. Because so far they've been raising rates and inflation's been coming down. Okay, that makes sense. And they can keep raising rates and it'll come down more. But is there a level where, we're there, now we can sit tight, the famous pause, and inflation will keep coming down. Now you don't know because it's not a controlled experiment. You can't do it twice. But they're getting close. So whether it's 5.25, 5.5 remains to be seen. But that's the terminal rate. But then Wall Street came up with this narrative, as soon as they're done hiking rates, they're going to cut them. This is the famous pivot we've been hearing about for over a year at this point. No, as far as they're concerned, forget rate cuts in 2023, maybe mid-2024, we'll get back to you on that. But there's one wild card in the deck, which is, that's the Fed's plan. So I just gave you the Fed's game plan. It's not, you don't need a crystal ball. They tell you what they're going to do. All you have to do is listen, although a lot of people don't. Wall Street makes up their own version of that. But the idea of rate cuts following hitting the terminal rate is, well, rate cuts go down, so dividends look higher, so buy stocks. Wall Street is always buy stocks. That's always the punchline. But they might cut rates late in the year, not because it's their plan, not because they want to, but we could be in a very severe recession. And that, at which point, because the Fed's always late, they're always following the market. They never lead the market. If they've already raised it, let's say they may already be at the terminal rate, not know it. And so if they keep raising, which I expect they will, they may throw this economy into a very severe recession, at which point they may have to cut rates, not because it's in the playbook, but because unemployment goes up to 7%. And but that gets back to the first question, Constantine, which is what's next. Disinflation may be deflation. The answer is diversification. Everyone goes, oh, we know that, diversification. But they know the term, but they actually don't know what diversification is. And I'll give you an example. I run into people all the time. They go, well, Jim, I'm fully diversified. I have 50 stocks in 10 different sectors: telecommunications, semiconductors, consumer non-durables, metals and mining. And I go, you're not diversified. You may have 50 stocks, but you're in one asset class called stocks or equities. And they're all going to go up together, or they're all going to go down together. And the more stressful the condition, the more reason you have to be concerned about it, the higher the correlation. On any given day, some stocks go up and stocks go down. But when you dial the stress meter up, they all tend to move together. So I don't care about your 50 stocks, your 10 sectors, that's not diversified. So what does real diversification look like? Have a sleeve of equities if you want, that's fine. I would say I look hard at oil, natural gas, natural resources, agriculture. Again, kind of equities that have hard assets behind them that will do well in inflationary times or even in recessionary times, because you need all those things no matter what. Then a slice of real estate. I wouldn't be in commercial real estate, but residential real estate, income producing real estate, farms, etc. That's good. I have a big slug of cash. And people go, well, cash doesn't have any yield. Well, lately the yields, you can get 2-3%, on like a CD. But even in a simple savings account, it is quite low. It's kind of less than 1%. But people don't understand the value of cash in a couple of respects. Number one, in a deflationary environment, we're not there yet, but we could hit that if the recession gets bad enough. Cash could be your best performing asset. It doesn't go up in nominal terms, but it goes up in real terms. If you have 2% deflation, your cash is worth 2% more in terms of purchasing power. But the real value of cash is optionality. And this is not well understood. I shared an office with Myron Scholes for 6 years, so I see options under the pillow, so to speak. But if you're the one with cash, when things, first of all, it'll definitely preserve wealth. So if things are falling all around you, your cash will be what it's worth, unless you're in Silicon Valley Bank. It's a separate issue. But although they got bailed out. But so it'll preserve wealth, even if it's not a high performer. It'll do very well in deflation. But the real benefit is when everything else is falling apart, you're the one who can go shopping. So it's kind of an at-the-money call option on every asset class in the world. Everyone's selling everything in a panic. You can bide your time, watch it go down, look for a bottom, and then say, okay, now I'll buy these things down 30% or 40% or 50% from where they were. Some alternatives. I have a number of investments in private equity and venture type situations, and they're risky and they're not liquid. But some of them will do very well. Some of them have done well, so that's nice. And then a slice of gold. And I recommend 10%. Because people, they put words in your mouth. They go, Jim Rickards says, sell everything and buy gold. I've never said that. Not a good strategy. But 10%, yeah. The supply chain breakdown is causing a lot of the inflation we see. And everyone's like, wait a second, why are you talking about deflation? That's coming next. People are not ready for it. I know the inflation's here. I buy gasoline. I shop in the grocery store. I get it. It's persistent. It's not transitory. I understand all that. But inflation has two major sources. One is the supply side, which is called cost push inflation. So that's energy price shocks, fertilizer shortages, strategic metal shortages, component suppliers who can't deliver stuff to factories in Germany and they're shutting down, et cetera. The other cause is from the demand side, and that's called demand pull inflation. Basically, it's psychological. Consumers pull demand forward. They're like, hey, I was thinking of buying a refrigerator. I better buy it today because the price is going to go up in 6 months.
We will now bring you clips from the interview. Please watch, share, and like this video. Also, ensure you subscribe to the channel, turn on post notifications, and share your thoughts about the video in the comments section below. Thanks and enjoy the video. The renowned economist Jim Rickards continued her speech as follows.
In the 70s, we had both. It started with cost push with the Arab oil embargo, but it ended up demand pull. I was starting my career at the time. Your boss would just give you a raise. You didn't even have to ask. Inflation was going up so fast. Like, I better give this guy a raise. Like, here's another, $30,000 or whatever, because people would quit, and that sort of spun out of control until Volcker squashed it all. Right now, we do not have demand pull inflation. We do have cost push inflation. The difference is hugely important because cost push inflation from the supply side, it's real, prices go up, but it's self-negating. The old saying that, the cure for higher oil prices is higher oil prices, because when they get too high, people stop driving. They shut down various activities. By the way, if you're unemployed, you're not buying any gasoline because you're not going anywhere. That's kind of a nasty way of putting it, but that's how the cost push inflation tips into a recession, and then prices come down. And we saw that in 1974. You had Jerry Ford and Alan Greenspan walking around with they had these win buttons, WIN, which stood for whip inflation now, except we had a recession and prices collapsed. Now, it came back by 77 for a lot of reasons, but right now we don't have demand pull, we have cost push. It will go away when this economy goes into recession, and then we're going to be talking about disinflation and deflation, which are, kind of close cousins. And the Fed's going to be out on a limb as usual, raising rates in the face of a recession and a price collapse. I don't know what the recession is a cure for. It's coming. The recession is coming. And Jay Powell said this. Jay Powell gave two speeches, August 26th, Jackson Hole, and September 21st at the press conference after the FOMC meeting that day. And the September 21st speech was almost like, well, just in case you weren't listening to me in Jackson Hole, let me tell you again what's happening. And then Jackson Hole, he was like Nancy Pelosi. He tore up a speech and wrote a new one, like literally the day before. It was 3 or 4 pages. It was really short. He used the word pain 3 times in one paragraph. I've been following Fed news for 45 years. I've never seen the word pain ever. But he basically said the same thing. But September 21st, he was even more blunt. He said, there's going to be a recession. It's going to be bad. Unemployment is going to go up. Get it straight. These things are going to happen. And that's what it's going to take to get inflation under control. But he went on and on about how inflation was job one, because the Fed has this dual mandate, which never made sense, but it's the law. Humphrey Hawkins. The dual mandate is price stability and low unemployment. Those two things don't always go together. And sometimes you got to make trade-offs between the two. But right now, the trade-off is very easy, which is unemployment's really low. Now, I don't put much weight on it, but the Fed does. Again, put your Fed hat on. Unemployment's really low. If unemployment went from 3.5 at the moment, if it went to 4.5, 4.9, is that the end of the world? Well, that was considered pretty low in 2013 when they were doing QE4 or whatever. So they're willing to do that. And they also think the recession, if it comes, will be mild, but those two things together will get inflation under control.
The renowned economist Jim Rickards continued her speech as follows. In the statement from Powell, indicated he didn't express that. Their focus is on the core PCE, the Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index, core, meaning excluding food and energy, and everyone's like, why would you exclude food and energy? Once again, I'm not here to argue about it. That's their approach. They aim to achieve a 2% core PCE annually. Powell didn't mention that we're going to increase rates until core PCE is 2%. He didn't say that. What he stated was that we'll raise rates until it has a constraining effect on inflation, and inflation will naturally decrease because rates will be sufficiently high to prompt that, at which point we, the Federal Reserve, will pause. Then you ask, well, when will you lower rates? He was like, the pause could last a year. So you're talking. TW. Let go of this Fed policy change nonsense. You're talking about 2024 before they reduce rates. It's similar to what I recall from Vietnam, the old saying, we had to devastate the village to preserve it. We have to damage the economy to rescue it. This is the most recent in a long series of Federal Reserve missteps since 1913. It seems to be their specialty, but that's what they're doing. And on top of all that, there's an impending global liquidity crisis, a worldwide financial crisis that differs from a recession. It's a financial panic, and recessions are distinct events. They can occur independently. In 1998, we had a financial panic, but there was no recession. In 1990, we had a recession, but there was no financial panic. In 2008, we had both. They can coincide. It appears they might be coinciding again. This is evident in inverted yield curves. Major dealers are competing in auctions for treasury bills. The Fed will provide you with treasury bills with a single phone call. All you have to do is contact the Fed and conduct a reverse repo. They'll provide you with some treasury bills. However, banks are bidding in auctions for treasury bills that yield a maturity lower than what the Fed will provide with a phone call. Why would they do that? The explanation is that the Fed bills cannot be rehypothecated. They cannot be used as collateral. However, the auctioned bills can. This indicates there's a collateral shortage. This implies reducing balance sheets, financial distress. And we also observe it not only in the Treasury yield curve, which is inverted from 6 months to 10 years at present, but also in the Eurodollar futures curve, which is even more concerning. It's not unprecedented, but it is rare, and it's not a good sign. Nevertheless, the Fed persists in raising rates despite this extremely unfavorable data. So, I anticipate a significant recession in the US, and the global outlook is fairly grim. Moreover, there's the possibility of a global financial liquidity crisis worse than 2008. If all I've said is accurate, which I believe it is, or I wouldn't be stating it, they could, at the very least, take a break now or even reduce rates. But if we're on the brink of a global liquidity crisis, as indicated by the Eurodollar futures curve and the Treasury yield curve, and negative swap spreads and Treasury bill auctions with a yield at maturity below what the Fed will provide with a phone call. I mean, all these developments are taking place. That's hard data, and it's a very, very concerning sign. Less evident in 2008, incidentally, prior to the Lehman Brothers collapse. So, with the economy naturally entering a recession, along with the brewing global liquidity crisis, why on earth is the Fed raising rates at all? That's unsustainable. So I foresee a more severe recession. That's one aspect, combined with Fed tightening, interest rate increases, balance sheet reductions, and so on. That's one whole dimension, and I wouldn't place much weight on a low unemployment rate. It disregards the labor force participation rate, which is abysmal. You know, it's around 62%, compared to 70% in the year 2000. However, unemployment is a lagging indicator. Unemployment rises after a recession begins. Employers are very reluctant to lay off employees. You have to pay severance. Recruiting and rehiring them and providing training is costly. Employers typically wait until the recession has already commenced, and they say, "Oh, well, I have to lay off some people." So it's not a leading indicator, it's a lagging one.
Don't forget to like our video and subscribe for our channel.
If one of our supply chains or one of another country's supply chains that we rely on collapse, it could cause an unprecedented economic super collapse on a global scale. And that's how we could end up with this $85 trillion economic super collapse I'm predicting. $85 trillion being the value of the global economy. Because remember, our current supply chain is interconnected on a global scale. And if there is a single point of failure, the whole system is going to come collapsing down. Farming, banking, healthcare, oil and gas, tech, and so on. This isn't the first time I've warned Americans about this before. On May 11, 2020, I told my followers, the economy will not return to normal for years. There are serious constraints on supply. I issued another warning about my research on November 24, 2021. The supply chain difficulties will certainly grow worse. The remedies will take years and sometimes decades to implement. And yet another in 2022. Don't believe the happy talk about a temporary supply chain crisis. I'll say that again. The crisis will last for years with predictable negative effects on economic growth. But now things are even worse than ever before. And I fear this economic super collapse could hit American soil in the next 6 to 12 months. So this may be my last and final warning before it's too late. It's why I'm warning people around me it's only a matter of time before the world economy comes crashing down. Because when you talk about risk of catastrophic collapse, the risk increases with the size of scale. Look, whether you decide to listen to me today about how to prepare, whether or not you decide to get access to the information in this envelope, that's up to you. It's a free country. You can do what you want. You can even pretend you never heard me tell you any of this. But just know, Joe Biden certainly isn't going to come to your rescue. Take a look at this 9-second clip from the president.
When do you think things will get back to normal?
When do I think things will get back to normal? But my hope is by this time next year, we're going to be back to normal.
That clip was taken over 18 months ago. It's up to you what you believe, but I can't bury my head in the sand and ignore all the facts, and the facts couldn't be more clear. So in just a moment, I'm going to explain how you can get access to this information inside the envelope as part of my super collapse preparation package. And I'm going to talk about what to do to protect and even grow your wealth. Look, please understand, it brings me no joy to say this, and I hope the worst of what I'm warning of never comes to pass. But there's only one potential solution to this crisis, and it's going to take years. Recently, I spoke to a very well-informed CEO of a major corporation, and I asked him point blank, I said, your company must be looking ahead at some possible solution. Is there anything you can share? Well, I'm going to tell you the same thing he told me. He said, Jim, you have to understand that it took us 30 years to build these supply chains. We blew it up in 3 years, beginning in 2018, and you can't put it back together. But there is one thing we can do. It's not a quick fix, but it's our best and most sensible option. Our only way out is to build a new supply chain that eliminates the bad actors. We can't continue to allow our enemies like China or Russia or Iran to threaten consumers here on American soil. As the Wall Street Journal wrote, Russia's lengthening war with Ukraine will lead to a near doubling of inflation rates in rich countries. It's why the New York Times wrote, this is what happens when globalization breaks down. And why Barron's wrote, secure U.S. supply chains with allies and move out of China. Unfortunately, this solution could take years or even a decade to fully implement. And that CEO told me it will take at least 10 years to reconstruct the supply chains if we don't want to do it with China and globalization. But whether you realize it or not, that's the bet we're making as a nation. It's happening now. And when the dust settles, we're either going to have rolled out this new supply chain before worst case scenario happens, or we're going to face whatever lies ahead from this $85 trillion economic super collapse. Now maybe you're wondering how bad things could really get. Let me answer that question with another question. Do you remember your life at the beginning of the pandemic? Despite all of our freedoms we all hold so dear, an unelected official with the ear of the president recommended immediate lockdowns, and suddenly we heard demands like shelter in place or stay at home, backed up by the threat of arrest. Large swaths of the economy ground to a halt. Looting took over our towns and cities. Because so many businesses were shut down, people were emboldened to take to the streets. But if most Americans don't have access to enough food, water, or other necessary supplies, do you really believe our streets and our businesses won't see more violence? It's why gun sales keep hitting all-time highs as more and more Americans prepare for whatever lies ahead. And while I hope the worst of what I'm warning in my urgent new book never comes to pass, I don't suggest you rely on hope to protect yourself and your family. I'm certainly not. Here's how I'm ensuring my family's well-being. First, I would suggest stocking up on essentials, just like I've done. I have a fully finished area in the basement of one of my properties, the address of which I keep totally private. It provides me with a warehousing area for months' worth of canned foods and other non-perishable provisions. That's important. Don't stop with a 3-day supply like the CDC recommends. Make sure you have enough water, basic food, and toiletries to last at least 3 months. And keep them in a safe area where they can sit without damage or spoiling. I would also recommend buying several large capacity freezers. I already have 3 and I may continue purchasing more. If you have the means, consider installing alternate energy solutions in case of a worst case scenario. I've already installed the largest non-commercial solar power system in New England on my property. If you can, have alternative sources of power generation on your property. I've also dug 3 wells, planted abundant gardens, and built a significant greenhouse. But whatever you decide, do recognize that none of it will matter if you're not getting accurate information about what to expect in the coming days. Like I said, to be able to make the right decisions during a crisis, you need to lean on someone. So if that's not me, you should find another well-connected person you can trust, ideally someone who's previously held a position of power in our government. But if you want to learn what's inside this envelope and see what I know, right now is your chance. See, I've gone ahead and published this information I'm holding here in this envelope inside my newest book. It has brand new proof of the unfolding situation and inside level details on how it will play out. Urgent Preparation Report number 1. Buy this asset after securing your family's food and energy. As the economy collapses and the shelves are bare, the government will respond by printing even more money. When it does, the value of the dollar will be destroyed through inflation. But 5,000 years of history proves that one item, gold, outlasts every other currency as a form of money. And I believe that economic collapse occurring right now will send gold skyrocketing over the next 6 months. That's why I'll send you my urgent report called The Perfect Physical Gold Portfolio. Everything you need to know about buying the right kind of physical gold. As part of my Super Collapse preparation package, you'll find everything you need to know about investing in gold before the price blasts through the ceiling, including, is gold safe to invest in? How much should I invest in precious metals? What metals should I buy and what should I avoid? What are the best places to buy gold and other precious metals? What are the safest ways to store gold to avoid theft or government confiscation? And much more. Plus, I'll also send you Urgent Preparation Report number 2, my Biden Bucks Protection Plan. I haven't mentioned it yet, but during my research, I came across a troubling executive order that President Biden just signed. See, every time there's an economic crisis, the government responds with massive new programs to try and control the economy and its citizens. In 2008, it was bailouts of big banks and new government agencies to regulate the financial industry. This time it will be much worse. I've uncovered a plan for U.S. government cryptocurrency I call Biden Bucks that I believe the government will unveil during this economic collapse to control your money and manage the societal fallout. By the time this program is announced, it will be nearly impossible for everyday Americans like you to protect their wealth and keep their privacy, which is why I've created another urgent report to get you prepared ahead of time. Inside this new report, you'll get step-by-step details on what these Biden Bucks are, why they'll be used during this collapse, and how to outsmart this sinister program by creating 1, an off-the-grid fortune. Secure $1.1 million in wealth inside a soda can safe. 2, saving your freedoms. Have liquidity and spendable wealth without using Biden Bucks. And 3, growing your personal wealth. You'll get possible investment upside as events unfold. And 4, ensuring you maintain your wealth regardless of external conditions. Building your own off-the-grid portfolio now will protect you from the government surveillance state coming during the economic super collapse. Biden Bucks testing is underway. The digital dollar could be rolled out soon. Before it's too late, make sure to protect yourself and your retirement savings. You'll find everything you need in this urgent report as part of my Super Collapse preparation package. But that's not all, because you'll also get Urgent Preparation Report number 3. Secure this secret off-the-grid asset. You see, I've learned of another little appreciated asset that's a liquid form of wealth. It can't be tracked or traced. It's completely legal and easy to find if you know where to look. Over time, its value has steadily grown, but very few people know anything about its investment potential. You're about to be one of the few. I believe you must include this secret asset in any off-the-grid portfolio. And what they meant was that nobody wakes up and says, oh, gee, I think I'll start a nuclear war today. What a good idea. That never happens. What does happen is you get into an escalatory situation, back and forth, where you're escalating and escalating, and you end up in a nuclear war. You never intended it, never started out that way, but you end up there through escalation. Now take that, and that is good analysis. Take that and apply it to what is now, I would say, the first full-scale economic war, sanctions war. We've had sanctions, for a long time, and we go back to at least the 70s with Iran, but even before that, FDR put sanctions on Japan. Nothing on this scale. This is unprecedented in its scope and application. And my only point is the effects of this are going to not just last a long time, yes, but they're going to pop up in very, very unexpected places. Let me make the point. There was never a war that was easier to prevent. There's never been a war that's easier to prevent, and there's never been a war that's easier to end. You could end this war in 48 hours or less. Having said that, I did expect that through a series of policy blunders and escalation, in this case, military escalation and political escalation, and then later in the book, around on page 250 or so, I have a whole section on Ukraine, Russia, and natural gas. So this has been brewing for a long time. You can go back to the 2008 Bucharest Declaration, but if you want to pick one thing and say, hey, when did this thing take a turn for the worse?
Right. So
that we were on a path to war. That was the color revolution sponsored by Obama and Biden, which was a coup d'etat. I mean, the president of Ukraine at the time, he was pro-Russian, and Obama set out to depose him, and they did. And they put in Poroshenko, who was a U.S. puppet, and at the same time, like 2 months after the color revolution, 1 month before Poroshenko, Putin took Crimea. He said, okay, that's how you want to play, fine. You move away from neutrality, move towards NATO, I'll take Crimea, your move. And then there was nothing. Putin didn't take one square inch during the Trump administration, because Trump is highly unpredictable, but put Biden back in, who was part of the original Obama-Biden team. And so not only was Trump not in Putin's pocket, he was the only one who stood up to Putin in such a way that Putin didn't take one square inch of territory. He took Crimea under Obama. Now he's taking kind of half the country under Biden. Didn't take anything under Trump. So that completely debunks that. But just to take it one step further, who is in the pocket of the Ukrainians, at least? The answer is Joe Biden, because of Hunter Biden, who made millions of dollars from Burisma, their large natural gas company. Ukraine is ranked in the low 90s of the most corrupt countries in the world. In other words, it's at the bottom on a corruption list with the most honest countries being on top. Ukraine is very close to the bottom. It's the most corrupt country in Europe, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Zelensky is just another oligarch, just another phony. Now, you can take sides, but to me, Putin's a dictator, Zelensky's a dictator. Pick your dictator. But this idea that he's some good guy Democrat is nonsense. Well, it's a phone call, basically. I mean, Biden's kind of non-compos mentis, but somebody who can string a few sentences together needs to call Zelensky and say, here's what we're going to do. You're not going to join NATO. We'll get the NATO Secretary General, John Stoltenberg, to say that. You need to say it, and the U.S. will say it. So you're not going to join NATO. You're not going to join the EU. You can be independent in the sense of being autonomous, but you have to be neutral. When you've got two great powers, whether it's the U.S. and Russia, or the U.S. plus Europe and Russia confronting each other, the idea of buffer states, I mean, that's as old as, if not history, at least the history of buffer states is several centuries old at this point. It's a part of what every international strategist looks at. So Ukraine should be a buffer state. It should be neutral. That way Putin has no reason to invade, and we have no reason to try to push the borders of NATO to a point slightly east of Moscow, which Moscow hasn't been attacked from the east since Genghis Khan. These sanctions will not work to stop the war or slow the war or change the outcome of the war. Now, they absolutely punish the Russian economy. Yep. They punish Russian individuals, consumers, Russian citizens. They're going to have fewer options, more expensive goods. Their economy is going to slow down. Unemployment will go up. The ruble is devalued. All those things are true. But they're also true in the United States. We're going to punish Americans far worse than the Russians. We're already seeing. I took a long trip yesterday. I filled up my car with gas at the end of the trip. It was $76. Inflation's here. We all see it. Price of gasoline, eggs, milk, butter, groceries at the store, rents, electricity, home heating, fuel, you name it. Across the board, inflation's affecting everything. And it started really in mid-2021. So here we are, almost 2023. So it's been going on for well over a year. For the first 6 or 7 months, Jay Powell and for that matter, Janet Yellen, were like, yeah, we see it, but it's transitory. We know that story. Finally, in November 2021, Jay Powell threw in the towel, said, okay, time to retire the word transitory. Now let's get to work. And they started raising interest rates in March 2022. And we're now up to Fed funds rate of 4%. They're going to raise them again in December 14th by another 50 basis points. We kind of, still a little bit away from that, but we know it's coming. The Fed, this is the no drama Fed. They tell you what they're doing in advance. So I always say you don't need a crystal ball to figure out the Fed. You just need to listen to what they're saying and believe them. So they're going to do 50 basis points in December. That'll get the policy rate of the Fed funds target rate to 4.5%. But that's from zero. March 1st, it was zero. So to go from 0 to 4.5 in less than 9 months, about 8.5 months, that's amazing. We haven't seen anything like that since Paul Volcker in the early 80s. Now, I know rates are not 13, 14%, but to go from 0 to 4.5, I can say in 8 months is a shock. Now, why is the Fed doing this? Well, they say they want to kill inflation. Okay, but there are two sources of inflation. Inflation can come from the supply side, what's called cost push inflation. Costs go up and they get pushed into retail prices and consumer prices, and that is what's happening. That's because of the supply chain breakdown, energy prices, shortages of goods, etc. So that's cost push inflation from the supply side. There's another kind of inflation that comes from the demand side, and this is much more psychological. It's when consumers say, they just have it in their heads, and maybe from objective data, that prices are going up, and so they change their behavior. They say, I was thinking of getting a new washing machine, but I was going to wait 6 months, but I better buy it now because the price is going to be a lot higher in 6 months. Or a car, or, suit of clothes, a dress, furniture, whatever it is, better buy it now because the price is going to go up. It's going to get worse. Inflation's here to stay. Commodities are going to boom. Oil prices are going to soar. Bonds are going to crash. And gold has been in a very funny situation, which is the following. Normally, you say, well, if there's inflation coming, why isn't the price of gold going to the moon? And why on earth would gold prices go up if there were deflation or disinflation? The answer is that you have to look at the yield to maturity on the 10-year Treasury note. That's our benchmark security. A lot of people look at LIBOR, but I'm like, no. If you're making investment decisions, you're buying a house, you're doing capital investing, these are all 5, 10, sometimes 20-year decisions. The 10-year note is the right benchmark for those large, long-term investments. Well, that's an alternative place to put money. You can buy gold, you can buy a 10-year Treasury note. So what's been true since last summer is as the yield to maturity on the 10-year note goes up, that strengthens the dollar, and gold prices have gone down because the dollar price of gold is just another cross rate, just another cross exchange rate. So a stronger dollar means a lower dollar price for gold. But if the yield to maturity in the 10-year note goes down, then that weakens the dollar, and the dollar price of gold goes up because a weaker dollar means a higher dollar price for gold. So curiously, the price of gold is being driven not by inflation in the abstract, but by the strength of the dollar, which is reciprocal to the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury notes. But here's what has changed. I talk about gold bull markets and gold bear markets, and I start my analysis in 1971, and I don't have to go through all that data, but that's how I think about it. And you're like, well, Jim, why 1971? Why not before that? And of course, 1971, it was when Nixon stopped redeeming dollars for gold. Americans couldn't even own gold in 1971. It was contraband. It was like drugs or machine guns or something. But foreign trading partners could redeem dollars for gold up until 1971. And then Nixon said no more. And then that was the final decoupling. But prior to that, gold was actually money. In other words, under Bretton Woods, gold was pegged at $35 an ounce. Prior to Bretton Woods, it was pegged at $20.67 an ounce. So going back to the 1920s or earlier, through most of the 19th century. For the United States and sterling, I think it was $4.75. It could be off a little bit on that, but it was four pounds and change. And as late as World War I, say 1913, if you were a Brit and you were getting on the steamer from London to at the time Bombay, today Mumbai, you took a purse of British sovereigns. British sovereign is about 8 grams, a little bit less. It's not an ounce; it's a quarter ounce, because an ounce is almost too much. Even today, what are you going to do with a 1 ounce coin that's worth almost $2,000? You're not going to use that to buy a pack of gum. But in the day, there was the quarter ounce, which today would be, like a $500 bill. So it's still a significant amount of money. But you could get on the steamer in Southampton and get off in Bombay at the time, and it was money good. You could take that British sovereign and spend it anywhere. And same thing in Singapore and Hong Kong and Japan or all around the world. So gold was actually money. So it wasn't a question of, what's the exchange rate? The gold was the money, and people thought about it by weight. They said, a sovereign, that's 8 grams of gold. So that's worth, that'll get you whatever. So, and that was true throughout history. And so it's really only since 1971, when we decoupled completely in terms of an exchange rate, that you have to think about, what's the dollar price of gold? Because it's not fixed. But okay, well, what happened to the memory? What happened to the 3,000 years I just talked about? Well, the answer is it happened in stages, and it actually took about 75 years. So it began in 1914. 1914 was the outbreak of World War I. Everybody needed gold. There was a run on gold, and countries needed gold because they knew they would need gold to pay for the war, to try to win the war. Well, it didn't matter if you're Germany, UK, or whoever. And remember, the United States was neutral. The United States did not get in the war until 1917. The war started in 1914. So for those first 2.5 years, New York was a money center to all of Europe, to all the belligerents. So everyone scrambled for gold. So if you were a citizen, they asked you to bring your gold to the bank, and they gave you paper money. But people did it out of a patriotic. It's existential. War's not a normal market. If you lose the war, you got bigger problems than your gold. And so people put the gold in the banks. What did the banks do? They melted it down and made 400-ounce bars. And they said, don't worry, your money's backed by the gold, but keep using that paper money, but it's redeemable for gold. But, oh, by the way, they're 400-ounce bars. Nobody walks around with a 400-ounce bar in her purse. I'm sure you've seen one, and I have as well. They're heavy. They weigh about 35 pounds. You don't walk around with them. So all of a sudden, the gold was still there, and the paper money was backed by gold in theory, but the gold had disappeared into the banks. That's step one. Step two, and this happened in the 1930s, the central banks took the gold from the commercial banks. So first, the commercial banks took the gold from the people. Then the central banks took the gold from the commercial banks, and the Federal Reserve System told all the banks, hey, send your gold to the regional Federal Reserve Bank. And of course, most of it went to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. So now it's not even in the banks anymore, right? But you're still walking around thinking your paper money is somehow attached to gold. But people haven't seen gold for a while, unless you're a collector. Step three, the United States Treasury and the finance ministries took it from the central bank. In 1934, the United States Treasury seized the gold of the Federal Reserve System. Bearing in mind, the Federal Reserve System is privately owned. And they gave them a gold certificate. And you go to the Federal Reserve System website today and, hunt around a little bit on the links and find the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, and it's there. And look in the assets. And the first line item is gold certificate, and it's valued at $11 billion. But that's because they value the gold at $42 an ounce. And I've revalued it, the answer is that today's market, that $11 billion is actually worth $470 billion. So the Fed has a hidden asset of $450 odd billion that's not on the balance sheet, represented by a gold certificate. But it's not the gold. The Treasury has the gold. And by the way, where do we keep our gold? I'm talking about the United States. The Treasury owns the gold. The Fed has a paper certificate. The gold is on 2 Army bases, West Point and Fort Knox. So I would say the Army has the gold. Gold has gone from citizens walking around having it in your purse, to commercial banks, to central banks, to finance ministries, held on an Army base. It's still there. The gold didn't disappear. But nobody talks about it, and everyone pretends it's not money. But of course it's money. But meanwhile, what's happened to the civilian population, the citizens? We stopped talking about it. We stopped saying it. We stopped learning about it. I remind people, just showing my age, but I got a graduate degree in international economics, and I was class of 74. But that was the year the IMF demonetized gold. But I was the last class that was taught gold in an academic setting as a monetary asset. If you're younger than I am and you know anything about gold, you're either self-taught or you went to mining college, because they just stopped teaching it. So now we have 2 generations of scholars who never learned a thing about gold. So they hid it, they took it, they buried it, they stopped teaching it, they stopped talking about it, and they pretended it's not there. Meanwhile, it is there. And Russia is a good example of someone who takes it seriously. In the U.S., we still have our 8,000 tons, 8,133 tons. We haven't given it away. We haven't sold any gold since 1980, by the way. We got the British to do it. We got everyone else to do our dirty work. The British sold more than half. No, seriously, the British sold more than half their gold. The Swiss sold 1,000 tons. The IMF sold 400 tons in 2010. That was the last significant sale by a monetary institution. Australia sold most of theirs. Canada sold most of theirs. If I were one of these other countries, I would say to the U.S., hey, why don't you sell some of your gold? But the U.S. doesn't. We haven't sold it an ounce since 1980. Inflation is coming down, by the way. And having said that, the target is 2%. So he's not there, but he's making progress. Now, Wall Street's saying, you're done. You did it. Mission accomplished. Inflation is coming down. You got what you wanted. Give it time. Stop raising rates. You're going to kill the economy. But the Fed is saying, well, we actually don't know. We can't untangle it. Yes, inflation is coming down. That's objective. But is it coming down because we're still raising rates? Or is it coming down because we're at the terminal rate? Those are 2 different things. And right now, and this is what Powell's been saying, the Fed leans to the view that they're not at the terminal rate, that inflation is coming down because they're raising rates. They have not achieved the terminal rate. So Powell and the Fed have said, yeah, inflation is coming down, but it's because we're raising rates, not because we're at the terminal rate. We're going to get to the terminal rate, and then we'll pause. And then if we're right, we'll just let inflation come down on its own. And that may take a year. So all this stuff about the Fed pivot and cutting rates and all that stuff, I mean, the Fed's thinking mid-2024 before they do that. Now, Wall Street, and I'll say markets, not just Wall Street, but the big money in places like the Eurodollar futures curve and the U.S. Treasury curve, which are highly inverted, are saying, no, you're not going to get that far. You may be at the terminal rate already. You're definitely going to cause a recession. It'll be more severe than you think, and rates are going to have to come down sooner than people expect. In other words, you've already achieved the terminal rate. You just don't know it, and you'll probably be the last to know. So with Wall Street, with the cheerleaders, sending that message, but with some serious market indicators, including yield curves, sending that message. Why is Powell sticking to the game plan as I described it? And the answer goes back to 1980, believe it or not, and what's called the Volcker mistake. And everyone knows, Volcker became Fed chairman in 1979. He stayed on until the early to mid 80s. And he did raise interest rates to 20% or very close to it to kill inflation, which went up to 15% at the time. But people forget that there was a recession in 1980. It was sharp but quick. It was over very quickly. It had nothing to do with monetary policy. The Carter administration issued some dopey regulation on a ceiling on credit card interest rates. And the industry said, fine, we're just not going to lend anybody any money. The economy fell instantly, kind of like a smaller version of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic panic. And then they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. And then they took the ceiling off, and then things got back to normal. Now, this was a time when farmers around the country were driving front loaders and tractors to Washington, and they were circling the Fed building. And one guy drove his tractor up the steps of the Fed, and Volcker was being burned in effigy. That all happened. So it was a little bit of pressure. And of course, Congress was up in arms and the White House was up in arms. So Volcker, not quite panicked, but he cut interest rates 7 percentage points, not 0.7, 7 full percentage points to deal with the recession, which, number one, was unnecessary because the recession was caused by a policy blunder from the White House, which was quickly corrected. And number two, he had not won the fight against inflation. Well, after he cut rates and we came out of that very quick sort of snap recession, inflation got even worse. And that's when Volcker had to raise rates to 20%. And Volcker, in hindsight, he said, we shouldn't have done that. We should have stuck to our inflation mission. So now Powell, remember, Powell's not an economist, he's a lawyer, so he kind of thinks like a lawyer. I can relate to that, looking at both sides. Powell does not want to be that guy. He does not want to be the guy who balks early and cuts rates, the famous Wall Street pivot, before the battle against inflation is won, because the outcome could be exactly what Volcker experienced, which is inflation wasn't done, doesn't go away, comes back stronger, and then you do have to destroy the economy, as we did in 1981-82. That was the worst recession. That was far worse than the little one in 1980. That was the worst since the Great Depression. We've managed to break that record several times since then, but at the time that was horrific. But Volcker and others have said that was a blunder he never should have done. So Powell does not want to give up the rate hikes too early because he does not want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He does not want to be that guy. And that's what's driving him, even as Wall Street screams, you're already there. So the question is, how does this play out? In my view, Powell probably is there. He probably is at something like a terminal rate. He probably doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. He doesn't believe that himself. His models tell him otherwise because they're relying on the Phillips curve, which is junk science. I mean, the last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was flat. At least where I went to school, curve was curved. This thing is flat. There is no correlation between unemployment and inflation. There just isn't. But the Fed thinks there is. So I always tell people, if you want to forecast Fed policy and understand the Fed, don't think like a rational person. You have to think like the Fed. You have to get inside their heads or else you're going to get it wrong. So they're looking at unemployment, which is the lowest. The unemployment rate is the lowest since 1969. Well, if you believe in the Phillips curve, then that's a sure sign of inflation. You know, as I say, even though it's coming down, it's still pretty high. They think they have to keep fighting this fight. But here's what they're missing. Here's where it all falls down. Yeah, inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down, but there are two sources of inflation. And it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them, the supply side and the demand side. Both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war when they cut us off from oil. And, you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that. Now, and again, this is what my book Sold Out is about, the breakdown of the supply chain, partly related to energy, partly related to the war in Ukraine, partly related to the pandemic panic. As I explained in the book, it actually predates that. The breakdown started in 2018 with Trump's trade war, and then COVID made it worse, yes. Ukrainian war made it worse, yes. But it really started before that. So, of course, prices went up and people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed, and energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward and it's behavioral. And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side, but by the late 70s, 80s, and Volcker, which we've just been talking about, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. You know, the old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand, and hurt the economy. And then it slows down, and then the inflation comes down on its own. That appears to be happening. But Powell hasn't really made the distinction. He's fighting the last war. I hate to use a cliche, but he's fighting the Volcker war. Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He thinks the battle's not won. He has to get to the terminal rate. In reality, he's probably already there. The future is very positive for gold. You have the normal vectors. Supply is flat, but has been for 6 years. Demand is going up. Central banks have flipped from net sellers to net buyers. That's a big deal. Retail and institutional interest is higher, so that's good. Geopolitical threats, don't need to say a lot. From the U.S. perspective, Iran, China, North Korea, Venezuela, Russia, you name it. So that's the vector. But the biggest driver right now is what I referred to a few minutes ago, negative real rates. because gold as a form of money, which is how I view it, competes with other competes with other instruments, treasury bills, etc. Well, if they have high yields and gold has no yield, you want the treasury bills. But if interest rates have negative yields and gold's just flat, gold looks more attractive. So that's the main driver, and that's going to continue. Everyone's like, well, the gold is up, gold is down. So what do you mean when you say that? And they're talking about the dollar price of gold. And it's like, okay, so the dollar price of gold is up or down. That's really a cross rate. That's no different than talking about the euro-US dollar exchange rate or Australian dollar-US dollar exchange rate. If you think of gold as money, and I do, then the dollar price of gold, with gold measured by weight, not as another currency, it is another form of money, but with gold measured by weight, it's a cross exchange rate. When the price goes up, I would say that what's really happening is the dollar is going down. In other words, I think of gold by weight. I'm interested, do you have a ton? Do you have 50 kilos? Do you have 5 ounces? Whatever you have as an individual investor, as a bank, I think of it by weight. Because when someone says gold's really going up, I said, well, no, the dollar's going down. You need more dollars to purchase a fixed quantity of gold, which means the dollar's worth less. And when people say gold's really going down, I say, no, the dollar's worth more, and you need fewer dollars to purchase a quantity of gold. In other words, when people talk about price, the first thing they do is they're really talking about dollars. There's a euro price for gold, but the world market is based on dollars. You're privileging the dollar as the numeraire. The numeraire is your counting system. Is it yards, inches, feet, whatever. And if you put the dollar first and say gold is in dollars and it's going up or down, I think you have it backwards. I think you need to put gold first by weight. And then if it's worth more, the dollar's going down. If it's worth less, the dollar's going up. And so when you say gold is going up, let's say it went to $2,000 an ounce. Everyone say, oh, the price of gold went up, just went up 10%. Well, did it, or did the dollar go down? The way I would phrase it is, it used to be $1,800 to get an ounce of gold. Now it's $2,000 to get an ounce of gold, or, your dollar got you 1/1800th of an ounce. Today, it only gets you 1/2000th of an ounce. In other words, gold didn't do anything. It's a metal, it's an element, atomic number 79. What happened was the dollar got stronger. So a stronger dollar is a lower dollar price for gold, and a weaker dollar is a higher dollar price for gold. So when people talk about gold going up, what they're really talking about is the dollar going down.
We have new numbers regarding how much gold central banks are buying, 400 tons in Q3 this year, records and numbers we haven't seen since the 80s. Yet we don't know some of those mystery buyers. Obviously, the theories are that they are Russia and China. Now
China is non-transparent. Russia is much more transparent, although Russia is starting to be opaque a little bit because they're in a war. But you can see the inflection point is 2010. So from 1970 to 2010, it's a long stretch, 40 years, central banks were net sellers. It didn't mean everybody sold everything, but Switzerland's down 1,000 tons, U.S. was down 1,000 tons after losing 8,000 tons, or sorry, 11,000 tons between 1950 and 1970. It was down, down, down. 2010 was the year that central banks became net buyers. Now, it doesn't mean every central bank was buying gold. It does mean that they were selling a lot less and others were buying more. And some of the buyers are Mexico, Kazakhstan, Philippines, Vietnam. We know China's a big buyer. We don't know exactly how much. Russia was a big buyer. That is continuing. Now the new players, Iran's non-transparent, but we know they're buying gold. Turkey is buying a lot of gold. Japan had a bunch of gold all along. They never told anybody about. Literally 1 month, their reserves went from 600 tons to 900 tons. Well, the market. You can't buy 300 tons in a month, not one country in one order. But they had it all along, but they decided to reveal it, put it on their balance sheet. So Americans don't seem to like gold. I'm not sure Canadians feel much differently, or others around the world. But central banks sure do, and I think that tells you something. There's huge demand for dollars all over the world, not because of the currency, but because of collateral, because of treasury bills. Banks need treasury bills to pledge as collateral for derivatives. It's the best collateral in the world. And if you don't have it, you're not going to be able to leverage your balance sheet as much as you would like. You're not going to be as profitable. You're not going to be able to support lending and investing, which is what banks in theory are supposed to do. To support the bloated balance sheets and to support the derivatives, you need collateral. And the better the collateral, the more leverage you can have. The best collateral in the world is a treasury bill. And so there's a mad scramble for treasury bills, which means there's a mad scramble for dollars to buy treasury bills. And that is coming from European banks, it's coming from Chinese banks, and banks around the world, but primarily European and Chinese. And that's not going away. So it's funny to hear people think it's funny to hear anyone talk about a dollar collateral shortage, like, hey, haven't you flooded the world with dollars? Hasn't the Fed printed $9 trillion? And the answer is they have. But that's not the measure. It's a high multiple of that. It's the dollar value of all the collateral. Because in the repo markets, I pledge the collateral to you, and then you pledge it to somebody else, one of our colleagues, and then she pledges it to somebody else, et cetera. That collateral gets pledged 50 times and supports not $1 a balance sheet, but $50 a balance sheet for $1 of collateral. And so you restrict the collateral, you're restricting the balance sheet. The dollar as a reserve currency will not be deposed overnight, but as a payment currency, there's a difference between a reserve currency and a payment currency. Anything can be a payment currency. If I want to pay you with baseball cards and bottle caps and you're okay with that, then it's a currency. So all of these organizations are working on new payment systems right now, and they're going to start to roll them out this year and later. So that's going to be a radical change in how we pay for things. I can give you 20 reasons why the dollar should go down, but I'll give you one big reason why it won't, which is the demand for collateral. And so that's keeping the dollar constant, which is keeping the dollar price of gold constant, because gold doesn't change and the dollar's not changing. Now that'll break, and that'll break in favor of gold, meaning the dollar will get a lot weaker. It'll have to, but it's going to take a few months at least, because the US economy has to get weaker, which it is. The Fed will figure this out maybe by September, next September. And then they'll ease a little bit and they'll try to weaken the dollar to try to give the US economy a boost, but we're not there yet. So it's going to be, now that doesn't mean the price of gold is going down a lot. I'm just saying it's not going to go up a lot. It's going to chug along kind of sideways, but when it breaks, it's going to break big to the upside because the dollar is going to go to the downside, but that's probably at least still a few months away, maybe longer.
We have new numbers regarding how much gold central banks are buying, 400 tons in Q3 this year, records and numbers we haven't seen since the 80s. Yet we don't know some of those mystery buyers. Obviously, the theories are that they are Russia and China. I'm curious to get your thoughts on central bank record buying of gold here and how Russia and China fit into this puzzle here.
Now, China's non-transparent. Russia is much more transparent, although Russia is starting to be opaque a little bit because they're in a war. But you can see the inflection point is 2010. So from 1970 to 2010, it's a long stretch, 40 years, central banks were net sellers. It didn't mean everybody sold everything, but Switzerland's down 1,000 tons, US was down 1,000 tons after losing 8,000 tons, or sorry, 11,000 tons between 1950 and 1970. It was down, down, down. 2010 was the year that central banks became net buyers. Now, it doesn't mean every central bank was buying gold. It does mean that they were selling a lot less and others were buying more. And some of the buyers are Mexico, Kazakhstan, Philippines, Vietnam. We know China's a big buyer. We don't know exactly how much. Russia was a big buyer. That is continuing. Now the new players, Iran's non-transparent, but we know they're buying gold. Turkey is buying a lot of gold. Japan had a bunch of gold all along. They never told anybody about. Literally in 1 month, their reserves went from 600 tons to 900 tons. Well, you know the market. You can't buy 300 tons in a month, not one country in one order. But they had it all along, but they decided to reveal it, put it on their balance sheet. So Americans don't seem to like gold. I'm not sure Canadians feel much differently, or others around the world. But central banks sure do, and I think that tells you something. And this is the thing that the markets and investors are not ready for. Inflation is going to come down fast. There's even some danger of deflation and a major U.S. recession in 2023. And no one's ready for that. I mean, people talk about recession, but it's going to be worse than they think.
And then they ramp up the printing press again, Jim.
Yes, but it doesn't work. You know, $9 trillion of QE didn't do any good. I mean, how does the Fed do QE? They buy bonds from banks, give the money to the banks give it back to the Fed as excess reserves. What does that do for the economy? Nothing. Zero rates, you know, again, it doesn't work. They don't have the tools. They're preparing for what we're talking about, which is a world where the dollar as a reserve currency will not be deposed overnight. But as a payment currency, there's a difference between a reserve currency and a payment currency. Anything can be a payment currency. If I want to pay you with baseball cards and bottle caps and you're okay with that, then it's a currency. So when we see the BRICS Plus, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, OPEC Plus, China individually, all these countries are the Eurasian European Economic Union, which is, you know, Putin's answer to the EU. All of these organizations are working on new payment systems right now, and they're going to start to roll them out this year and later. So that's going to be a radical change in how we pay for things. When the price goes up, I would say that what's really happening is the dollar is going down. In other words, I think of gold by weight. I'm interested, you know, do you have a ton? Do you have 50 kilos? Do you have 5 ounces? Whatever you have as an individual investor, as a bank, I think of it by weight. Because when someone said gold's really going up, I said, well, no, the dollar's going down. You need more dollars to purchase a fixed quantity of gold, which means the dollar's worth less. And when people say gold's really going down, I say, no, the dollar's worth more, and you need fewer dollars to purchase a quantity of gold. In other words, when people talk about price, the first thing they do is they're really talking about dollars. You know, there's a euro price for gold, but the world market is based on dollars. You're privileging the dollar as the numeraire. The numeraire is your counting system. You know, is it yards, inches, feet, whatever. And if you put the dollar first and say gold is in dollars and it's going up or down, I think you have it backwards. I think you need to put gold first by weight, and then if it's worth more, the dollar's going down. If it's worth less, the dollar's going up. In 1914, when World War I started, all the major powers went off the gold standard. They said, we got to keep our gold. This is real money, and this is how we're going to win the war. And the Bank of England was faced, and the Exchequer was faced with the same choice. Keynes was an advisor to the Exchequer. He said, don't go off the gold standard, stay on the gold standard. And the reason was that if you did that, you would preserve your reputation and preserve your credit. He said, the war is not going to be won with money or gold. It's going to be won with credit. But if you stay on the gold standard, you'll have the credit. And that's exactly what happened. Jack Morgan, Pierpont's son, organized huge loans for England and France and nothing for Germany. And England won the war. So the point is, Keynes got that right. Now, flash forward, 1925, he's talking to Churchill, and Churchill wants to go back to the gold standard. And Keynes is telling him, you got the price wrong. You know, we can't go back at, you know, £4.25 or whatever the exact rate was. We've got to devalue the sterling by half because we doubled the money supply to fight the war. Churchill ignored Keynes's advice, and they went into a depression before the rest of the world. Flash forward 1944, you're at Bretton Woods. Keynes wanted a gold standard. And this isn't speculation. He wrote papers. He gave formal presentations. So 1914, he's pro-gold. 1925, he's telling Churchill, you're nuts. You can't go back to a gold standard at this price. 1944, he's pro-gold again. I call that a pragmatist. Inflation, yeah, prices go up, so we understand that. Or maybe put differently, the value of your money goes down. You don't get as much for your money, same thing. But inflation, broadly speaking, has two causes. One is called cost push. This comes from the supply side. So there's a shortage of oil there, and we've got a financial and economic war going on between Russia and the United States. The U.S. really started it, but U.S., EU, Canada, Australia, Japan versus Russia. That's obviously disrupting supply chain, cutting down energy supply, causing the price of oil to go up, etc. So that's coming from the supply side. The other source is demand, what's called demand pull inflation, which is more psychological. Consumers are thinking about choices and they say, you know, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. I was going to wait 6 months, but hey, the price is going up. I better go buy it now before the price goes up. In the 1970s, we had both. We started with cost push from the Arab oil embargo. but it flipped into demand pull in the late 70s and it just spun out of control and Paul Volcker had to crush it. Today, the inflation is coming from the supply side. Some of the things we talked about, higher fuel costs. I mean, everything has to be transported, so fuel is part of everything. It gets built into the price of everything, and there are other shortages and bottlenecks and costs that have to be taken up by manufacturers and distributors. The Fed can't drill for oil. The Fed can't plant wheat. The Fed can't make semiconductors, so they can't do anything about this. And the supply chains are breaking down. They were breaking down before the war in Ukraine, but Ukraine has made it worse. The Fed can't do anything about cost push. They can't do anything about the price of oil. But they're looking at the demand side, saying, hey, if this supply thing goes on long enough, eventually the psychology will change and we'll get demand pull and behavioral. And that is really hard to change. If we're on the verge of a global liquidity crisis, as revealed by the Eurodollar futures curve and the Treasury yield curve and, negative swap spreads and Treasury bill auctions with the yield to maturity below what the Fed will give you for a phone call. I mean, all those things are happening. That's hard data. And it's a very, very troubling sign, last seen in 2008, by the way, before the Lehman Brothers meltdown. If all that's happening and the fundamental signs are also weak, which we just saw in third quarter GDP, which is based on net exports, which won't last. How are you going to drive a trade surplus with the strongest dollar in 20 years? Good luck with that. I mean, nobody can afford our stuff and we're not buying anybody else's stuff. So with the economy going into a recession on its own, with a global liquidity crisis brewing, why on earth is the Fed raising rates at all? But I found some really, really interesting research that, because everyone says, well, yeah, COVID messed it up and the war in Ukraine messed it up. Well, that's true, but it didn't start there. This started in 2018 with Trump's tariffs. The U.S. and Brazil are the two largest exporters of soybeans. China is the world's largest importer of soybeans. China was buying all their soybeans from the United States just as a way to kind of make it up a little bit. Like, well, we got to buy the soybeans anyway. Why not buy them from the U.S. to keep the U.S.-China trade deficit under control so it doesn't become too politically toxic? Well, as soon as Trump threw on the tariffs, China retaliated by moving their soybean orders to Brazil, stop buying U.S. soybeans. Well, that's not a phone call. I mean, you're talking about vessels, port facilities, agriculture, trucks. How do you get the soybeans to the ports? How many do you grow? Where's the fertilizer coming from? Et cetera, et cetera. And all those parties, the shippers, the cargo, the insurance companies, there's so many people involved, banks, letters of credit, it's just a lot involved. They don't like short-term relationships. They say, okay, I'll do it. I want a 5-year contract. And China said, okay. So they reconfigured all those transportation lanes to get the soybeans from Brazil. All of a sudden, you're a U.S. soybean grower. You say, well, what do I do? Well, we start selling them to the Netherlands because the Netherlands needs soybeans too. So now instead of shipping them from like Port of LA to Ningbo and near Shanghai, we're shipping them from Port of Houston to, France, or Marseille or someplace, or Rotterdam. So the point being, you completely scrambled all these supply chain relationships. Economic growth is weak. We're in a recession. I don't care what Janet Yellen says. I don't consider her expert on the topic, but we've had our 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP. Like it or not, that's the definition of recession. The fact that the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is a private group, by the way, but they're the recognized referees on recessions and recoveries, the fact that they haven't said so doesn't mean anything because they never do say so until 9 months or a year after it happened. And for that matter, most recessions are 2 quarters, some 3, some have been longer, but most recessions are a couple of quarters. The National Bureau of Economic Research usually declares a recession after it's already over. Like it started, it happened, it's over, we're in recovery. And they go, oh, by the way, we had a recession last January. Debt to GDP sky high, economy weak at best, probably had a recession in the first half. Maybe that's continuing. People talk unemployment close to an all-time low. Yeah, but even at 3.5% or so, that is extremely low. I mean, I go back to the 1960s, and that was low by the measures of the 1960s. But that completely ignores probably 8 to 10 million Americans who were perfectly able of having jobs and working. Prime age, 25 to 54 years old. It's never 100. I mean, there's always, you could be a homemaker, a student, they're retired, early retirees. There are a lot of reasons people aren't in the workforce, but not, taking 10% off or 14% decline from the starting place in over 20 years. That's so if you throw those people into they're not called unemployed because they're not looking for jobs, but if you threw them in, unemployment would be closer to 10%, which is a recession or depression level, actually. The baseline deficit is $1 trillion. So your deficit's out of control and your trade deficit's out of control. I don't want to overuse metaphors, but one metaphor is you have a very beautiful, expensive vase and somebody knocks it over and it breaks into 5,000 pieces. You can't put the vase back together. You've got to go get a new one. And that's what's happened with the supply chain. What I call supply chain 1.0 from 1989 to 2019 is broken. There will be a new supply chain. There always are. Supply chains have been around since the Bronze Age, if not earlier. But the new supply chain, what I call supply chain 2.0, will look very different than the old supply chain. Right now, we're in an in-between period where things don't work well. Again, it doesn't mean total chaos, but you still see shortages, you still see higher prices, which are coming from supply chain disruptions. And these things are not easy to fix, but they can be replaced, and that's what I expect to happen. We'll hear from them at some point, but we're in a recession now, and people say, what about the third quarter? And it's interesting because I do put some weight on the Atlanta Fed GDP now. I do think it's a very good tool. They miss sometimes, they're not always accurate, but it's the best tool out there. But very few people understand their statistical technique. Because what Wall Street does, you get a whole bunch of components for GDP, and they come in at different times with different lags, and you add them all up and you get GDP. And what Wall Street does, they look at what they have and they project all the rest based on regressions and correlations, which don't necessarily hold up. But here's what we think. Here's our forecast for third quarter GDP based on projections of what we don't know. Atlanta doesn't do that. Atlanta takes what we do know, hard data, and they ask a different question. They say, what would GDP be now if this was all we had? And they put out a number. But they don't guess at the stuff they don't have. And it fills in as it goes along. So it's much more Bayesian in that sense. But because of how the data comes out, the time sequence to which the data comes out, it typically fades as the quarter goes on. It's not because they're using bad methodology. It's just because that's how they do it. And so just in the last week, 9 days or so, it went, everyone was cheering. I think with September 1st, it was 2.3%, maybe a little higher, but about 2.3%. 2 days later, it was 1.6, and now it's down to 1.3. Around November 2021, you'll recall there were headlines, bare shelves, empty shelves, supply chain breakdown, Christmas will be canceled, etc. And it was all true. You went to the supermarket. It didn't mean that every shelf was completely bare, like East Germany in the 1950s. But there, paper goods might not be there, or maybe your favorite kind of tomato sauce, or chicken, or whatever it was. There were some things there, but a lot of things weren't there, and that got worse. And then, of course, gas prices skyrocket because of basically because of a lot of bad policy from the United States in terms of Keystone Pipeline and a lot of other factors. That then got worse. It eased up a little bit in the summer, but it never went away. This is a complex system. It was breaking down. That was very... Inflation, nominally, prices are going up. Okay, so that's inflation. But it can come from two sources that are opposite. One is from supply side shocks, supply chain disruption. We saw that in 1973 with the Arab oil embargo over the Arab-Israeli war at the time. The price of oil quadrupled, etc. That was a supply shock. The thing about supply side inflation is it's self-negating. It burns itself out. So, the old saying, and it's true, the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices. In other words, when things get too expensive because of supply disruption, people can't afford them, businesses close, you get layoffs, you go into recession, and prices come down pretty quickly after that. The other source of inflation is from the demand side, and this is a completely different dynamic. We saw this in the late 70s, where prices are going up, but people have some bargaining power, so unions are on strike, they're getting higher wages. I worked at Citibank in the late 70s, early 80s, so the supply side disruption tends to snuff itself out. The demand side inflation tends to feed on itself. It gets out of control. And then we saw what Paul Volcker did with interest rates in 1981, where he took them to 20%. He caused a recession in terms of tight monetary policy to snuff out the inflation. But otherwise, if you don't do that, that just runs away. Now, the inflation we saw in 2022, late 2021, 2022, it was real. It wasn't transitory the way Jay Powell said. So the global economy is in bad shape. It's going into a recession. Now, a lot of people have said that, we're going to have a recession as if it's no big deal, but they're expecting a mild recession. And I see a much more severe recession based on a lot of factors, some of which we've spoken about. Now, the other half of your question, which is important to listeners, is what does this mean for financial markets? And there, the best way I've been able to explain it, imagine you're in an Irish pub and you got three Irish storytellers. And I'm part Irish, so I can talk about the Irish, but they're telling three different stories and you got to listen to each one. So there's the Fed story, the market story, and then there's something called reality, what's actually happening. So the Fed story kind of goes like this. The Fed, forecasting what the Fed's going to do is the easiest thing I do. It's not because I have a crystal ball or I'm smarter than anyone else. The Fed actually tells you. All you have to do is listen and believe them. Now, a lot of people don't listen, or they listen like, oh, the Fed will never do that. They will. They actually mean it. Starting in June 2022, that was the peak, and this inflation is coming down. Now, it's still too high. The Fed's not done. We're going to see at least one more interest rate hike, maybe, but they're going to leave one more on the table. We'll see what happens in June. I'm not forecasting June, but I would not rule out another interest rate hike in June after the May hike. So, because Jay Powell's thinking, how many times do I have to say this? He's given 9 speeches since August 2022, August 26th at the Jackson Hole, then September FOMC meeting, November FOMC meeting, end of November, a speech at the Brookings Institution, December FOMC, congressional testimony, et cetera. And every time he said the same thing. Inflation is job one. We've got to get unemployment up. Believe it or not, we're going to have a recession and unemployment's going to go up. Sorry about that, but we've got to get inflation under control. So is inflation here? Absolutely. It's in Australia, it's in the United States, Europe. You see it all over the world, actually. Even Japan, which has suffered from deflation more often than not, is seeing inflation of about 4%. That may sound low to an American or an Australian, but that's sky high to the Japanese. So they're feeling the price shock as well. So it's real and it's here. It means that you may not like the price, but you have no choice. You've got to go to work, take the kids to school, deliver goods, use your truck and your job, whatever it is, you have to do it. You have to pay that higher price. But it means that $75 extra at the pump, maybe twice a week, so $150 a week. That's $150 you don't have to spend on something else. Could be concert tickets, a show, dinner, a new dress, a new suit of clothes, whatever it might be. You're not going to buy that because you've just spent that much money on the gasoline. Well, that means all those other industries suffer. Retailers have lost sales, restaurants have empty tables, concerts have empty seats, and so forth across the entire spectrum of goods and services. Well, soon enough, that results in layoffs, some business failures, price cuts, etc. And that disinflationary and deflationary trend ends up in a recession. So this is unprecedented. It's never been this high. It breaks the pattern of running it up in war and paying it down in peace. No one roots for war, but they happen. And it's worse than that because of modern monetary theory. People say, well, Bitcoin's not backed by anything, or the dollar's not backed by anything, or the euro's not backed by anything. And I say, yes, they are. They're all backed by the same thing, which is confidence.
Right.
If I think something's money and you think it's money and I tender it to you for goods and services and you think you're confident you can give it to Francis for goods and services and we have a large enough group, it's money.
Right.
It can be, we were kids, we did this with baseball cards and bottle caps, so anything can be money if there's confidence. But confidence is fragile. It's easily lost. And when you lose it, it's very, very difficult to regain. So how do you survive that? What's the optimal asset allocation method? Well, the key is diversification. You may have 50 stocks, but you have one asset class, which is stocks. And they're all going to go down together or go up together, as the case may be. But particularly in times of stress, they become highly correlated. So having 50 different stocks or ETFs or whatever is not diversification. That's just having a whole bunch of bets in one asset class. So what does real diversification look like? Well, you should have some, 10-year treasury notes, or if they're a little too volatile for your taste, look at a 5-year note or a 2-year note. Real estate, definitely. Not so much commercial real estate, too soon for that, but multifamily housing, residential real estate, farms, good slice of cash, maybe as much as 30%. People hate cash. They go, I don't get a yield on cash. Cash is a waste of my time, etc. Cash is the opposite of leverage. It reduces the volatility of the rest of your portfolio. So if you have volatile investments in the wings, cash is it's like a bar connecting two ends of the barbell. It has very low volatility, but most importantly, it gives you optionality. The answer is diversification. Everyone goes, oh, we know that, diversification. But they know the term, but they actually don't know what diversification is. And I'll give you an example. I run into people all the time. They go, well, Jim, I'm fully diversified. I have 50 stocks in 10 different sectors: telecommunications, semiconductors, consumer non-durables, metals and mining. And I go, you're not diversified. You may have 50 stocks, but you're in one asset class called stocks or equities. And they're all going to go up together, or they're all going to go down together. And the more stressful the condition, the more reason you have to be concerned about it, the higher the correlation. On any given day, some stocks go up and stocks go down. But when you dial the stress meter up, they all tend to move together.
You brought up chapters 1 and 2 from Currency Wars, where you basically highlight this scenario. You said the scenario you presented at the time was that Russia and China would accumulate large gold reserves, pool their gold, and launch a new digital currency backed by gold in the place of the U.S. dollar. Is that the form it would take for you, something backed by gold?
Probably, and here's why. And by the way, when I wrote that, and when we did the war game, and when I wrote that, Russia had about 600 tons of gold, and today they have 2,300 tons. China had about 600 tons of gold, and today they have about 2,000 tons, just slightly less, that we know of, and they may have several thousand tons off the books in the State Administration of Foreign Exchange that we don't know about, because that's completely opaque. So Russia and China did exactly what we warned the Pentagon about in 2009, exactly, which is increase their gold reserves by a factor of 4 or more. But everyone's like, well, the Chinese yuan is going to be the global reserve currency. No, it's not going to be the ruble. But here's why. Well, there are a lot of reasons, but the main reason is, when you talk about reserve currency, you have to understand what that means. It's not like the People's Bank of China has a bunch of $100 bills on pallets stacked up in the basement. When people say reserve currency, what they really mean is the currency of the bonds that they invest in. In other words, they're dollar-denominated assets in the form of treasury bonds or notes. That's what China actually has on their books, not like the dollars per se. So if you want to suggest or hypothesize that the Chinese yuan is going to replace the US dollar as a global reserve currency, where's the yuan bond market? I mean, it doesn't exist. Very small scale, very illiquid, no primary dealers, no win issue trading, no auctions, no repo, no settlement clearance, none of the plumbing and the mechanics of a mature bond market such as the United States. And above all, they don't have a rule of law. I mean, at least if somebody reneges on treasury bond, you can sue somebody, but you can't do that in China. So the absence of the rule of law, number one, the absence of the infrastructure, the plumbing, for want of a better word, are two reasons why the yuan and certainly the ruble will not replace the dollar as reserve currency. However, what I was hypothesizing then, and I would come back to this, is you can create a brand new currency that does have all that stuff. And in my example, they used a Swiss bank, UK law, put the gold in a third-party depository. If you wanted some of the new currency, you could deposit your own gold and get some of the currency or trade with them or run a surplus. So it was a replacement system, but you would need the gold to instill confidence. But they don't have bond markets, so they're not going to have them soon. So the yuan and the ruble aren't going to replace anything.
In the terrifying picture you've just painted, Jim, how should we be protecting ourselves here?
Well, you want assets that are going to be immune from a global liquidity crisis. What are they? Land, real estate, gold, silver, fine art. I see Andy Warhol, Marilyn Monroe has gone, they estimate $200 million. You could have bought that for $50,000 in the 1970s. That's a little more specialized, but there are, natural resources, water, et cetera, energy, oil. If you want to be in stocks, okay, get stocks of companies that are based on natural resources, such as ExxonMobil, Chevron. I mean, I'm just giving these as an example, but, so there are a lot of ways to protect yourself, but, a regular stock portfolio is not a good one. And, banks are going to be in distress. Money market funds are going to be in distress. That's what a liquidity crisis is.
We seem to have a huge chunk of our working age population that is not working. And you probably study this more than most people. Like, what's truly going on there? Do we have is it just an aging population that truly can't work? I know that disability it's seen massive growth over the past 15 years. Are there a bunch of people that are opting out or gaming the system or whatever? But what's responsible for us only having 62% of our working age population actually engaged in working?
Well, there are two answers to that, but they're consistent. I'll give you both. The short answer is it doesn't matter. You listed a number of factors. I'll go back over those factors, and you're right. But it doesn't matter. It's low is low. In other words, the thing about labor force participation is a very simple calculation. You say how many people are working. That's the numerator, and how big is the labor force. That's the denominator. That's all it is. Now it's never 100%, right? Because there are students and homemakers and retirees and others. There are good reasons for some people not to be in the workforce at any given time. But as recently as 2000, that number was 70%. What drove it between approximately 1975 and 2000 was basically women entering the workforce, women who had been home, as homemakers or, performing other roles, entered the workforce, and then that number went up. So, like I said, it's never 100, but 70 was very strong. 62 is down a lot. I mean, that's about a 14% decline. Look, GDP, the standard definition is, it's consumption plus investment plus net exports plus, government expenditure, like a 4-part thing. Yeah, but there's a simpler way to do it, which is how many people are working, how productive are they? Just who's working and how productive are they? That equals nominal GDP. And if you have fewer people working, the economy is going to shrink unless productivity is going up, which it's not. And so this is one of the major headwinds. Now, you're right. There are some early retirees. There were a lot of people who stayed home, obviously, during COVID, and it's very well studied and clear that working is a habit. It's a good habit, I think, for the most part. But it's like any habit. Once you break it, it's hard to go back. So once you get used to not working, or working from home, or we're just staying home, the government was handing out checks. Beginning with Trump in, I believe it was June 2020. Everybody got that one was a $1,400 check. And then in December 2020, at the end of the Trump administration, everybody got a $600 check. And Biden comes in February 2021, not to be outdone. He hands out, I think, a $1,600 check. So everybody got a check, like 2 or 3 of them. And a lot of younger people opened accounts on Robinhood and started trading Bitcoin. That didn't work out too well. But a lot of people saved the money. But there were very definite spikes in retail sales coming within 30 days of the checks. Well, that's not surprising. I give people free money, they'll go buy stuff. And that kind of kept the economy going. It wasn't a real boom, but it looked good. But we're not doing that anymore. There's no more checks. And so you had a lot of people who lost the habit, a lot of people staying home, watching, maybe the World Series or whatever, eating Doritos, but they're not working. And a lot of people out of the habit, but they just got used to government handouts. Not everybody, but some. And the other problem is because people say, wait a second, how can you have low labor force participation when everywhere you look, there are help wanted signs, which there are. I mean, McDonald's is paying $35,000 for an entry level like cashier or hamburger, maker, with benefits, training, and advancement. Well, that's pretty good for, entry level hamburger person. So there are and people call this a labor shortage. There isn't actually a labor shortage because we just talked about how you've got perhaps as many as 10 million, people between the ages of 25 and 54 who are sitting home. But the problem from the employer's point of view, there's a shortage of willing workers.
Willing workers, yeah.
Not workers, but willing workers. Well, what makes you willing to work? Well, a raise, a good pay is one. As employers can't afford to pay the clearing wage to get people off the couch because they'll go bankrupt themselves. They're working on very small margins. Sales are declining, et cetera. So I'll pay as much as I can to get the workers, but it's not enough to get this person off the couch, so to speak. And so you've got this really weird situation. I use weird in the technical sense, where you have a huge pool of able-bodied, potential workers, but a shortage of willing workers because you can't pay a clearing wage. But that's more a reflection of how stressed businesses and how low margins are. And then you look at the big names. I mean, I guess Twitter is the most recent, but, Amazon, FedEx, Target, they're all looking at big layoffs and
big layoffs,
big layoff announcements coming every day. So, none of which is good for the U.S. economy. But, the Fed looks at unemployment. I mean, I look at it because you're supposed to know what it is. I mean, I always say, if you're trying to forecast the Fed, you got to look at the world the way they do, even if it's messed up. Like, even if they're looking at the wrong things, which they are, as an analyst, you have to look at them to figure out what they're doing. That's how you do intelligence work. Think like the other guy. But then once I take my Fed hat off and say, well, what do I think? The unemployment rate is almost irrelevant. First, that's a lagging indicator. Secondly, it ignores what we talked about with labor force participation. There is no Phillips curve. I mean, you can draw one. Last time I saw a Phillips curve was flat. Or I went to school, curves weren't flat. But that's, but they're just looking at the wrong indicators.
You brought up, chapters 1 and 2 from Currency Wars, where you basically highlight this scenario. You said the scenario you presented at the time was that Russia and China would accumulate large gold reserves, pool their gold, and launch a new digital currency backed by gold in the place of the U.S. dollar. Is that the form it would take for you, something backed by gold?
Probably, and here's why. And by the way, when I wrote that, when we did the war game, and when I wrote that, Russia had about 600 tons of gold, and today they have 2,300 tons. China had about 600 tons of gold, and today they have about 2,000 tons, just slightly less, that we know of. And they may have several thousand tons off the books in the State Administration of Foreign Exchange that we don't know about because that's completely opaque. So Russia and China did exactly what we warned the Pentagon about in 2009, exactly, which is increase their gold reserves by a factor of 4 or more. But everyone's like, well, the Chinese yuan is going to be the global reserve currency. No, and it's not going to be the ruble. But here's why. Well, there are a lot of reasons, but the main reason is when you talk about reserve currency, you have to understand what that means. It's not like the People's Bank of China has a bunch of $100 bills on pallets stacked up in the basement. When people say reserve currency, what they really mean is the currency of the bonds that they invest in. In other words, they're dollar-denominated assets in the form of treasury bonds or notes. That's what China actually has on their books, not like the dollars per se. So if you want to suggest or hypothesize that the Chinese yuan is going to replace the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency, where's the yuan bond market? I mean, it doesn't exist. Very small scale, very illiquid, no primary dealers, no win issue trading, no auctions, no repo, no settlement clearance, none of the plumbing and the mechanics of a mature bond market such as the United States. And above all, they don't have a rule of law. I mean, at least if somebody reneges on a treasury bond, you can sue somebody, but you can't do that in China. So the absence of the rule of law, number one, the absence of the infrastructure, the plumbing, for want of a better word, are two reasons why the yuan and certainly the ruble will not replace the dollar as a reserve currency. However, what I was hypothesizing then, and I'd come back to this, is you can create a brand new currency that does have all that stuff. And in my example, they used a Swiss bank, UK law, put the gold in a third-party depository. If you wanted some of the new currency, you could deposit your own gold and get some of the currency or trade with them around a surplus. So it was a replacement system, but you would need the gold to instill confidence. But they don't have bond markets, so they're not going to have them soon. So those the yuan and the ruble aren't going to replace anything.
In the terrifying picture you've just painted, Jim, how should we be protecting ourselves here?
Well, you want assets that are going to be immune from a global liquidity crisis. What are they? Land, real estate, gold, silver, fine art. I see Andy Warhol, Marilyn Monroe has gone. They estimate $200 million. You could have bought that for $50,000 in the 1970s. That's a little more specialized, but there are, natural resources, water, et cetera, energy, oil. If you want to be in stocks, okay, get stocks of companies that are based on natural resources, such as ExxonMobil, Chevron. I'm just giving these as an example. But so there are a lot of ways to protect yourself. But a regular stock portfolio is not a good one. And banks are going to be in distress. Money market funds are going to be in distress. That's what a liquidity crisis is.
We seem to have a huge chunk of our working age population that is not working. And you probably study this more than most people. Like, what's truly going on there? Do we have is it just an aging population that truly can't work? I know that disability it's seen massive growth over the past 15 years. Are there a bunch of people that are opting out or gaming the system or whatever? But what's responsible for us only having 62% of our working age population actually engaged in working?
Well, there are two answers to that, but they're consistent. I'll give you both. The short answer is it doesn't matter. And now you list a number of factors. I'll go back over those factors, and you're right. But it doesn't matter. It's low is low. In other words, the thing about labor force participation is a very simple calculation. You say how many people are working. That's the numerator, and how big is the labor force? That's the denominator. That's all it is. Now it's never 100%, right? Because there are students and homemakers and retirees and others. There are good reasons for some people not to be in the workforce at any given time. But as recently as 2000, that number was 70%. What drove it between approximately 1975 and 2000 was basically women entering the workforce, women who had been home, as homemakers or, performing other roles, entered the workforce, and then that number went up. So, like I said, it's never 100, but 70 was very strong. 62 is down a lot. That's, about a 14% decline. Look, GDP, the standard definition is, it's consumption plus investment plus net exports plus, government expenditure, like a 4-part thing. Yeah, but there's a simpler way to do it, which is how many people are working, how productive are they? Just who's working and how productive are they? That equals nominal GDP. And if you have fewer people working, the economy is going to shrink unless productivity is going up, which it's not. And so this is one of the major headwinds. Now, you're right. There are some early retirees. There were a lot of people who stayed home, obviously, during COVID, and it's very well studied and clear that, working is a habit, it's a good habit, I think, for the most part, but it's like any habit. Once you break it, it's hard to go back. So once you get used to not working, or working from home, or, we're just staying home. The government was handing out checks, beginning with Trump in, I believe it was June 2020. Everybody got that one was a $1,400 check. And then in December 2020, at the end of the Trump administration, everybody got a $600 check. And Biden comes in February 2021, not to be outdone. He hands out, I think, a $1,600 check. So everybody got a check, like 2 or 3 of them. And a lot of younger people opened accounts on Robinhood and started trading Bitcoin. That didn't work out too well. But a lot of people saved the money. But there were very definite spikes in retail sales coming within 30 days of the checks. Well, that's not surprising. I give people free money, they'll go buy stuff. And that kind of kept the economy going. It wasn't a real boom, but it looked good. But we're not doing that anymore. There's no more checks. And so you got a lot of people who lost the habit, a lot of people staying home, watching, maybe the World Series or whatever, eating Doritos, but they're not working. A lot of people out of the habit, but they just got used to government handouts. Not everybody, but some. And the other problem is, because people say, wait a second, how can you have low labor force participation when everywhere you look, there are help wanted signs, which there are. I mean, McDonald's is paying $35,000 for an entry level, like cashier or hamburger, maker, with benefits, training, and advancement. Well, that's pretty good for, entry level hamburger person. So there are and people call this a labor shortage. There isn't actually a labor shortage because we just talked about how you've got perhaps as many as 10 million, people between the ages of 25 and 54 who are sitting home. But the problem from the employer's point of view, there's a shortage of willing workers.
Willing workers, yeah.
Not workers, but willing workers. Well, what makes you willing to work? Well, a raise, a good pay is one. As employers can't afford to pay the clearing wage to get people off the couch because they'll go bankrupt themselves. They're working on very small margins. Sales are declining, et cetera. So I'll pay as much as I can to get the workers, but it's not enough to get this person off the couch, so to speak. And so you've got this really weird situation. I use weird in the technical sense, where you have a huge pool of able-bodied, potential workers, but a shortage of willing workers because you can't pay a clearing wage. But that's more a reflection of how stressed businesses and how low margins are. And then you look at the big names. I mean, I guess Twitter is the most recent, but Amazon, FedEx, Target, they're all looking at big layoffs, and
big
layoff announcements coming every day. So, none of which is good for the U.S. economy. But, the Fed looks at unemployment. I mean, I look at it because you're supposed to know what it is. I mean, I always say, if you're trying to forecast the Fed, you got to look at the world the way they do, even if it's messed up. Like, even if they're looking at the wrong things, which they are, as an analyst, you have to look at them to figure out what they're doing. That's how you do intelligence work. Think like the other guy. But then once I take my Fed hat off and say, well, what do I think? The unemployment rate's almost irrelevant. First, that's a lagging indicator. Secondly, it ignores what we talked about with labor force participation. There is no Phillips curve. I mean, you can draw one. Last time I saw Phillips curve was flat. Or I went to school, curves weren't flat. But but they're just looking at the wrong indicators.